Welcome to the Contrary podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. My apologies in advance. I usually like to start off the week on a lighter note, but that's kind of impossible this week. And you can always tell that I'm in a certain mood when in my newsletter I start quoting Matthew Arnold, Dover Beach, that you can tell it's going to be a little bit dark. But the reality is that normally we get caught up in the flotsam and jetsam of the news cycle, just trying to keep up with the flood of it. And then we have weeks like last week where you have to step back and recognize that history has changed. I mean, there's a bogus quote from Lenin. I didn't realize it was a bogus quote, but there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. Now, Lenin may not have said it, but I think it's appropriate, because I think that what happened last week was feeling the tectonic plates of history shifting. And who better to talk about this than Susan Glasser? Susan Glasser. But by the way, first of all, welcome to the podcast, Susan. I appreciate it very much.
Oh, Charlie, it's great to be with you. These are challenging times, so it's best to sort it through together.
Yeah, and we have to sort it through together. I mean, Susan is a staff writer at the New Yorker, writes a fantastic weekly column on life in Washington. Is host of the Political Scene podcast, and was the co-author with her husband, Peter Baker, of the book The Divider, Trump in the White House, 2017 to 2021. We're going to look back on that as kind of the kinder, gentler era of the Trump presidencies. But Susan, let's talk about this, because I think part of it is getting our heads around the consequences of what's happening. Everything is happening so fast. I was looking at your column from last week, and you talk about what happened a week ago Friday. Last Friday night, minutes after President Donald Trump announced the firing of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a purge of the military's top lawyers, I received an email from my cousin in Los Angeles. "Why are we not on the streets?" she wrote. And then you go through all the things that had happened that week, and that was before the week that followed and what happened on Friday. So let's just start with this. What happened in the Oval Office on Friday?
Yeah, I mean, here we are speaking on Monday midday, and it feels like that was a kind of a before and after moment, a crossing of the Rubicon, if you will. And, in many ways, we've been building up to that moment of public rupture between Trump and Zelensky. We've been talking about, I've been writing my column actually for the previous several weeks about the very pronounced shift in American foreign policy that Trump was undertaking. And, so for me, the signs were clear, and the message from Trump had already been received that, the United States was no longer going to be allies and partners with Ukraine, but in fact was actually openly switching sides in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I think as we digest the sort of catastrophic impact of that confrontation in the Oval Office, though, it's clear that it's a pivot that's not just away from actively supporting Ukraine in the conflict, but it's this geopolitical shift in orientation for the United States of America.
Yes.
And we can talk about that. But to your specific question, what happened in the Oval Office on Friday? I think Donald Trump and JD Vance, had this, already much dissected confrontation with Vladimir Zelensky, in which they were supposed to be having Zelensky there to talk about signing this deal that would enable the U.S. and Ukraine to work together, developing Ukraine's natural resources. Some of Trump's advisors were promoting this as a way to actually give Trump some skin in the game of supporting Ukraine in the longer term. And it looked to me like JD Vance sort of successfully goaded the boss into blowing all that up. He played upon Trump's years-long personal animus towards Zelensky. They tag teamed him. They got Zelensky in a place where he was pushing back, which has now been interpreted by MAGA world as, how dare he levels of insubordination from essentially a vassal state.
Even from some mainstream media, they're saying, well, he misplayed his hand, because didn't he understand that he was supposed to go in and grovel, on all fours? What's wrong with Zelensky? It's like the first time we see someone stand up to the bullying. It's interesting how there is a stream of a strain of conventional wisdom that somehow that was wrong for Volodymyr Zelensky to defend his country and to correct the president.
That's correct. What you've seen is quite remarkable, and again, it shows how Trump and those around him have become very successful over these last 8 years and 6 weeks. And I really insist upon that. People keep saying, "Oh my
Yeah.
God, it's 6 crazy weeks." It's 8 years and six
Mm-hmm.
crazy weeks of the Trump era, and they've been very successful over time at defining the contours of almost any debate. So even Trump's critics often tend to adopt his framing. And I think, Charlie, that that's some of what we're seeing. Trump's critics and independent minded people somehow adopting Trump's frame that let's beat up on Zelensky. Let's say that it's his fault for this confrontation. And I think, first of all, in a narrow sense, I have looked at the specific
Mm-hmm.
fight in the Oval Office. I've looked at the broader 40 minutes in which it played out. I've looked at the transcript. And, unless you define Donald Trump as essentially, kind of a king, uh,
Yeah.
and, define any disagreement with him as insubordination or fighting or
Mm-hmm.
rudeness, uh, other than that, it's very hard to support the interpretation. If you notice, what
Yeah.
Zelensky does is he defends the interests of his country in a polite way. Donald Trump and JD Vance attack him in personal terms.
Mm-hmm.
You never see Zelensky saying anything personal to them, except he says, "Well, you should come visit my country." Is
Right.
that a personal insult?
Well,
It's hard.
they were thin-skinned enough to take it that way.
Right, exactly. Now, you could, I think, question Zelensky, and many have, including many of his supporters, on a sort of tactical level. You can say, okay,
Mm-hmm.
fine, fine. Clearly, Trump is a bad guy here, but look, Zelensky knows this, and he should have just, bowed and scraped
Right.
and said, "Thank you, Mr. President," and gotten the hell out of there,
Yeah.
with meaningless piece of paper. And by the way, I talked with many people before the meeting, including senior European officials who believed that, it was essentially a meaningless piece of paper, the rare earth minerals deal between the United States and Ukraine. And so, of course, Zelensky should have just signed it, gotten out of town, and regrouped with his actual partners who are not in
In
the Oval
Europe.
Office. Yeah. So again, it's hard to know. I mean, certainly that might have been a wiser course of action, but I will say this, Farley. Donald Trump had made it clear in the previous any number of weeks and years, frankly, where he was taking American foreign policy. And so, in a way, it exposed uh, what was going to happen one way or the other. And I believe that very much so.
Well, let's go. There are a couple of interesting questions about this, and as you point out, we have switched sides in the conflict. We had done that earlier in the week. Time moves so quickly. We forget the UN vote was a real inflection point where we sided with Russia in the United Nations on this particular issue, and that was breathtaking in and of itself. But then, of course, you came to this meeting on Friday, which was supposed to be Vladimir, Zelensky was supposed to come in, kiss the ring, sign that deal, the latest shakedown. It's not the first time that Donald Trump has tried to extort Ukraine. But was it an ambush? Because there was a couple of things that felt wrong. It was supposed to be a photo spray, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, which can last like 30 seconds to a minute or so, and then the press is ushered out, and then you have a private conversation. This thing went on for 40 minutes, so that was unusual in and of itself. Also, it's extremely unusual for the vice president to insert himself into a conversation between two presidents. And you were mentioning the transcript, and I've gone over the same sort of thing. And it was going on until JD Vance basically felt like pulled the pin. And as you point out, goaded Trump into it. So in one interpretation is that everything just went off the rails because people lost their temper. The other interpretation is what was this whole thing about? Were they setting Zelensky up? Was the goal to humiliate him? And was the goal to humiliate him, or was this something that nobody really wanted, that everybody wanted that deal signed and everybody was going to go away. And then something went wrong because J.D. Vance is, the bearded homunculus who doesn't know how to behave around grownups. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look at the aggressive, and I mean
Yeah.
aggressive spin
Yeah.
emanating from the White House all weekend long after the confrontation through friendly journalists who they've essentially gotten to amplify the idea that no, we were shocked at Zelensky's rudeness, and we were, planning this
Yeah.
really nice thing. So that's a data point. I would say beware aggressive spin emanating from the Trump
Yeah.
White House, number one. But that's their line, and they've been pushing it very aggressively, and with success among journalists. Number two, you have the actual transcript. And what that suggests is it went on for a long time. There wasn't anything in particular that was different except for JD Vance's interjection.
You're right.
And you know, I had the sense, well, Vance understood that this public televised event was going to come to an end soon, and it was almost like, oh wait, I need to get my point in before the press leaves the room. So to me, that is one, very legitimate possible interpretation. The other thing I would suggest is that while it had the effect clearly of undercutting Zelensky and giving Vance and Trump ammunition that they then used essentially to make
Mm-hmm.
the rift with Ukraine more permanent and visible. It also might have had the effect of boxing Trump in.
Yeah.
Remember that JD Vance has been probably the most public and visible leader of what you might call the anti-Ukraine, pro-Putin caucus in the Republican
Yeah.
Party, predating his time on the Republican ticket with Trump. So going back to his early tenure as a senator and as a politician, JD Vance openly campaigned for the Senate, saying, "I don't care about
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine. I don't want to do anything for Ukraine." He was against all of the
Mm-hmm.
military assistance for Ukraine, and has been even more publicly critical, arguably, of Zelensky and Ukraine than Donald Trump has been. And Trump himself has also been very critical of Ukraine and calling Trump's invasion of Ukraine strategic genius. And so you said you started out the week thinking of Matthew Arnold. Well, I started out the morning, thinking about George Orwell, because now, right before we got on this podcast, you had Donald Trump, putting out more social media hate, really hate toward Zelensky, and making it clear that it wasn't a one-off aberration or a fit of temper on Friday, but a new foreign policy direction for the country. And frankly, the reason I'm thinking about Orwell is because the United States seems to be backing the war candidate and calling him the man of peace. If you
Yeah.
say you're for peace, then you're not for the guy who started the war. That is an Orwellian inversion of fact and history. And we don't know where that's going to lead us, but it's never going to
Mm.
be taking us to a good place when the leader of the United States of America, calls war peace and calls lies truth.
Yeah, I mean, I repeat this phrase too often, but once again, as you pointed out, Donald Trump has been signaling his affinity for Vladimir Putin for a very, very long time. We talked about this during the campaign that a Trump election might mean the betrayal of Ukraine, but it is still shocking to watch it play out in real time. We need to move on from this, but you mentioned earlier that what happened on Friday was incredibly revealing. And I thought one of the extraordinary moments was when Trump went off, talking about his affinity for Vladimir Putin. I mean, there he is, humiliating and insulting Vladimir Zelensky, and explaining that he could never say anything negative about Putin, because how do you negotiate with somebody if you don't say nice things about him? Whatever. Speaking of Orwellian, but this little section here where he goes, "Let me tell you, Putin went through a hell of a lot with me. He went through a phony witch hunt where they use him in Russia. You ever hear that deal that was a phony? That was a phony Hunter Biden, Joe Biden scam, Hillary Clinton, shifty Adam Schiff. It was a Democrat scam. And he had to go through that. And he did go through that, which is an amazing thing because, first of all, it's like he and I together, and we're victims. Vladimir Putin is the victim here. And, I'm listening to that and reading that transcript and going, so, it is now an article of faith in the right in the Republican Party that Russia was a hoax. But after Friday, don't you think that Russia was a real deal, and now we are seeing the disastrous, tragic endgame of it?
Look, Charlie, first of all, we have to say and reinforce it because it's been wildly successful as a point of propaganda for Trump. So let's just level set and say that it is the conclusion of all of America's intelligence agencies that Russia interfered in the 2016 US election on behalf of Donald Trump. It is well documented. It is extensively concluded. Much of the evidence is made public, not only in the Mueller report, but also in the bipartisan U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee report that came out at the end of Donald Trump's first term in office.
Again, didn't Marco Rubio sign off on that?
He did. Senator Marco Rubio being a very different character in our public life than Secretary Marco Rubio. But, read the Senate Intelligence Committee report. My guess is that most people haven't even read the top line findings from it. Russia intervened in our election. The great shocking event in 2018 at the infamous Helsinki press conference following the Trump-Putin summit was when Donald Trump took the word of Putin over that of his own intelligence agencies. And by the way, I think it's a marker of our own, sort of political transition and especially the degradation of the Republican Party that there actually was a pretty big furor, even among many Republican elected officials and even members of Trump's own administration after the Helsinki press conference. Well, here we are, flash forward, not even 6 years later, I guess that's right. The summer of 2018, 6.5 years later. And basically, it's a deafening sound of silence after this event in the Oval Office between Zelensky and Trump. And by the way, what happened and is happening right now is much more significant for American
much more.
That was a press conference where Trump shocked by revealing what he, clearly already privately thought, which is that he'd rather take Putin's word than the Intelligence Committee. But there were no actions really that were accompanied by that. And the things that he discussed privately with Putin, he doesn't seem to have followed through on at that time. Whereas right now, Donald Trump is taking a series of very concrete and destabilizing actions to change America's alliance structure, to withdraw its support from Ukraine, and to become an active supporter of Russia and its revisionist geopolitical vision on the world stage. So this is much more disruptive, and we've heard much, much less, basically almost nothing from any Republican officials. It's really a moment that should be marked, in our collective frog boiling. The frog is pretty much done and boiled.
Oh yeah, no, except for those pictures where you could see, what's left of Marco Rubio's soul leaving his body as he's scrunched down in the couch. Okay, because we live in the dumbest possible timeline, I do have to mention this, that there was some commentary that Zelensky showing up not wearing a suit was one of the flashpoints that it annoyed Trump. I mean, the first thing he said to him was, you're all dressed up or something like that. I guess I have to mention this because this is the way Zelensky always dresses as a wartime leader. This is basically the way Winston Churchill dressed when he met with FDR in the middle of World War II. But also, this was within days of Elon Musk showing up at the cabinet meeting, wearing a T-shirt and a MAGA hat. And nobody ever says to Elon Musk, nice get up there. So I'm sorry, I didn't even want to dwell on the clothes. So let's just talk about Europe. Among the extraordinary scenes was watching the new leaders of the free world gather in London to fill the gap created by America's abdication of this. And of course, then the question becomes, how is Europe going to react? Is Europe going to now step up? And is this one of those, again, dramatic turning points in history where Europe realizes, okay, we're alone. We can no longer trust or rely on the United States, or even treat the United States as an ally? What happens in Europe now?
Well, first of all, to your point about Elon Musk and Zelensky, I would say Saturday Night Live pretty effectively debunked
Mm-hmm.
that as an on the level criticism from Trump. It's not on the level. That's the truth. And actually, the thing about the outfit is the tell. That's how you know it's bullshit on some level, and that it's I don't know if I'm allowed to say that on this podcast.
You are.
It's just it's not it's not honest. The critique of
what a surprise.
Europe, its bluff is being called. And for many years, presidents of both parties here in the US, going back to Barack Obama, have pushed Europe to spend more on its own defense and to take more responsibility for its collective security. That has been a bone of contention. As the threat from Russia has perceptively escalated, you have seen cause European countries to spend more and more. Putin was a more effective raiser of the defense budgets in Europe than Barack Obama, Joe Biden, or Donald Trump combined. And, so now the vast majority of our NATO allies now spend 2% or more of their GDP on defense. That was the goal for 2024 that they had agreed upon quite some time ago. Now they are going to collectively need to raise that number. Donald Trump has already laid what I think is kind of a ticking time bomb, frankly, for NATO that hasn't gotten enough attention, where he said from the beginning of this return to office that he thinks allies should spend 5% of their GDP on defense. To make clear, no one in NATO currently spends 5% of its GDP on defense, including the United States, which spends about 3.5% of its GDP on defense. So why did Donald Trump say that? Why has it not gotten enough attention? My view is he's laid the time bomb there, and then he can say at the appropriate moment, see, they didn't listen to me, I'm out of here. And so I'm really concerned that pulling out of NATO is the next turn of the wheel here.
Elon Musk tweeted, right, that we should pull out of NATO. And I mean, it's very clear that Elon Musk has gone rogue, that he has his own foreign policy. He doesn't clear everything. But again, he made it very clear it's time to leave NATO. This has always been the fear and the threat.
Exactly. He did that after the Zelensky meeting this weekend. Remember that Donald Trump is the guy who, back in the 2016 campaigned explicitly saying NATO was obsolete. As our book, The Divider, and others documented, Trump came much closer to withdrawing from NATO in the summer of 2018, right before he flew from Brussels to Helsinki for that disastrous summit meeting with Putin. In fact, he came as close as anyone has ever come to blowing up the NATO alliance, and only just pulled back from the brink there. So we know that Trump, unconstrained, would like to pursue this policy because that has been his view for a very long time.
Well, he is unconstrained, right? I mean, he is acting as he's completely unrestrained by Republicans, by the other institutions.
Is going to stop him? No, Pete Hegseth isn't going to stop him. He's assembled a cabinet of yes men and empty suits who fit the Fox News camera needs. And so I think this is a very real next possibility. You asked about Europe. They face huge problems of capacity, of working together across national lines that still matter very much when it comes to security and defense. And they face their own political hurdles. I think it would be very, very hard for France and Germany to make the necessary structural changes in their economy and in their government to spend huge sums on defense. Now, Germany has a new chancellor incoming, Friedrich Merz. He's a much more national security focused. He says that he's going to spend a lot more of Germany's resources on defense, that he's going to be there for Ukraine in a much different and more robust way. The bottom line is Ukraine would not have been fighting on these last few years without the US, not only military assistance, but also intelligence assistance, logistical assistance. And right now, if we disappeared, it would be very, very hard for Europe to pick up the slack, even though I do think we should say to people Donald Trump is lying and misrepresenting. He constantly says that the United States gave so much more money than Europe. In fact, he claims that it was $350 billion. Nothing like that. It was, much more in the $100 billion range, first of all. Second of all, Europe collectively has now given more to support Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion than the United States has. And, so I just think it's important to tell
Very
people.
hard. Well, we don't know. I mean, let's talk about the optics over the weekend, though. I mean, they may not be able to step up, but it was rather striking, wasn't it? How enthusiastically they embraced Zelensky. I mean, they went out of their way to make it clear that they were not, on Team Trump, that they were not going to support him. And I think the one picture that probably frosted Trump more than any other was when Zelensky met with the King Charles, standing out there, shaking his hand. So they clearly are sending the message, but there's also the undertow of European leaders telling him, you got to fix this thing with Trump. Somehow we have to do it. We can be the intermediaries or anything. So what are the prospects? You point out that Trump is still, disgorging hate texts. Is President Zelensky going to show up again at the White House wearing a suit and a long red tie and willing to go in and tug his forelock? Are we going to see that at least performative, okay, we're going to fix this? Or is that off the table now?
Look, I think there will be, of course, there are already robust efforts to fix this, but probably fixing this would not involve that kind of a face-to-face meeting with Zelensky, because I don't think it would be productive. So that's first of all. Second of all, as far as Europe goes, I think one thing it underscores is a fallacy in Washington's thinking. And I've heard this, for well more than a year, talking about a possible Trump presidency. Republicans and even some Democrats, just the hubris that Washington often applies to foreign policy thinking has really colored so much of the commentary that people are hearing emanating from Washington these days. And I would like to debunk some of that and say it was always a fantasy idea that Donald Trump could click his heels together, wave his magic wand in the White House, and force Ukraine to accept a deal that was not in their national interests. And that was always bullshit. Again, sorry for the use of the word again.
Don't worry.
What I was hearing very clearly from my Ukrainian sources, from Eastern European sources, I think is now proving to be correct, which was that, hey, wait a minute. Any negotiations by Donald Trump that fail to take into account Ukraine's national interests are not going to result in peace. They're going to result in a weakened Ukraine, possibly aided by, Poland and its Baltic neighbors and some other Europeans fighting on without Donald Trump's deal, because Donald Trump will try to impose conditions that are impossible for Ukraine to accept. So that, I think, hopefully has now become a little bit more clear to people, that Ukraine can't simply just be negotiated with, out being at the table. And frankly, the Afghanistan precedent is one that people should have taken into account here. And it's the inward looking stupidity, frankly, of much of our kind of pundit class, Democrat and Republican, that they just pretend like countries are just going to do it. Because you know what? That happened to Afghanistan. And Ashraf Ghani, the then leader of Afghanistan, our alleged ally, was not at the table when Donald Trump negotiated a shameful exit with the Taliban and excluded the government of Afghanistan. And look what happened. The government of Afghanistan collapsed. Ghani was, rushing out of town on
Yeah.
his helicopter, leaving his country to fall. Well, Zelensky saw that, and he's saying to Donald Trump here, and he and the Europeans are saying, you can't leave Ukraine out of the deal. It now has the second most powerful army in Europe, and it's not just going to roll over because you have some weird obsession with placating Putin. So that's number one, is maybe the death of that fallacy that Ukraine will just accept whatever deal
Yeah.
Donald Trump has to make. And Donald Trump is kind of going crazy over that. Number two, that I'd like to just suggest, and again, I don't know what's behind it, but I think it's important to consider, is some of the bizarre behavior from Trump we are seeing maybe because Vladimir Putin has not indicated a willingness to make a deal.
Mm.
That Vladimir Putin hasn't exactly come to the table with Donald Trump and said, great, here's the deal I'd like. As far as I can understand it, Putin is still saying, I would like everything that I demanded from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's really not much of a deal for Trump either. And so I think the reality is sinking in a bit for Trump at the White House, that he's not going to solve this war in 24 hours or even in 100 days. And that doesn't look good for him, as he might say himself.
All right, let's switch gears here, because one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you was your column, Why Aren't We in the Streets, which felt like kind of a cry of the heart that a lot of people are experiencing. And you walk through all of the things that are happening right now, all of them. And it is incredibly difficult to keep up with the fire hose and the zone being flooded. Again, cliches that we keep recycling, but it is true that, a lot of things that are happening. I was thinking about this over the weekend. A lot of things that are happening, actually, things are happening every single day that if we had said they were going to happen last year, we would have been accused of Trump derangement syndrome. And yet, you point out, like, Trump is, Trump the Almighty keeps moving ahead. And so far, the response has been quiescent. Where are the Democrats? Where is the opposition? So talk to me about that, because one of the big questions is, can he be stopped? Because he's not all powerful. We still have the courts. There still is a Congress not totally made up of potted plants. There are still people in government. There is still a ragtag remnant of the media out there, although that seems to be shrinking all the time. So talk to me about that column when you sat down and you wrote, why are we not in the streets? What needs to happen? What do you want to see happen? What could happen?
Well, look, Charlie, first of all, I should give credit where credit is due. Why Aren't We in the Streets was from an email that my cousin Linda, a lawyer in Los Angeles, sent to me minutes after the previous Friday night's outrage.
Friday night.
Exactly. Yeah. When Trump fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and all of the military's top lawyers and the female head of naval operations. And so she sent that in, and she made the point, not only why aren't we in the streets, but, if this was happening in France, they'd have occupied all the government buildings by now. And I feel like that just viscerally kind of connected with me. So I was thinking about that all week long as the subsequent kind of unprecedented, jaw-dropping developments unfolded. Monday, the third anniversary of the war in Ukraine, Trump voting with Russia and North Korea and Belarus against all of our allies, and Ukraine.
Staggering.
Tuesday, eliminating the century-old tradition of an independent press pool and saying from henceforth it was only Trump and his minions who would decide who could be in the press pool. And by the way, that being accepted largely by the media with nothing more than Susan Collins-esque bleats of concern. Wednesday,
Strong emails.
Elon Musk on Wednesday holding forth at the first cabinet meeting of the second Trump administration before any of the members of the actual cabinet were allowed to speak. Thursday, the renewed threats of tariffs, 25% tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and more tariffs on China as well. And we could go on. So in the middle of all this, you have James Carville come out with this op-ed in the New York Times saying Democrats should essentially roll over and do nothing. And those, by the way, were his actual words.
Right.
It sounds like a parody, but that was the context for my cousin's words ringing in my head by the time I was writing this on Thursday. And I'm a journalist, you're a journalist, we're observers. We put things together critically. We try to analyze, we try to look to history or precedent. We try to frame up different arguments. There are always different arguments on the side. And what the reason I mentioned the Carville thing is because it wasn't some crazy Carville outlier, as sometimes they are, but actually something that I have heard from many senior Democrats since the election. And it's mystified me, frankly, throughout. This idea in particular that's taken hold, that the resistance, quote unquote, in Trump's first term failed. I feel like, just as a matter of fact, and again, I'm not a political strategist. It's not my job to advise or to know what the right thing to do is. But just as a matter of fact, did the resistance fail when they defeated the Republicans in the midterm elections, when they defeated the Republicans in the 2020 elections, ousted Trump from office successfully, when the internal resistance constituted many of the most senior officials in Donald Trump's own government, who successfully constrained him from pursuing many of the very, very disruptive policies that he is now implementing with striking speed and effect. So from my perspective, in fact, flawed as it was, it's just not a historically accurate framework for Democrats as they try to come up with something that should work right now. And then the final point that I just think is so important to make is that, unfortunately, I see this as a sign of our extreme political polarization, that in this moment, everything is now seen through a partisan lens, as in party, as in the interest of the Democratic Party. But my view is, in the first 6 weeks of Trump 2.0, we have seen quite clearly that the interests of the elected political class of the Democratic Party are not the same things as the interests of civil society in America, as the interests of America itself. And whether individual Democratic strategists or politicians may decide that they don't want to do anything because they can benefit personally more in the midterm elections by shutting up right now, okay, maybe that's their calculation. But I will tell you, as someone who has lived in a society, Russia, where democracy was rolled back in a very short period of time, the time to stand up is not when it suits Democratic elected officials, but when institutions of our democracy are being threatened. And that's the absence that I've noted. And I will just finish here. Sorry to go on, but
this is very important.
Important about this. Last night, I was speaking with a really good friend, not really a very political friend, who grew up in Iran and left that country before the revolution. And, she was saying to me, going through all the ways in which a huge swath of Iranian society, not just the Ayatollahs, were against the corrupt and dictatorial regime of the Shah in Iran, but only one faction in society, the extreme religious faction, had the militia, had the power ultimately to seize control, and they're still in power decades later in Iran. And she said to me, she said, look, the time is now to act, to save American institutions. And again, it was so powerful and deeply upsetting to have that conversation, because who are you hearing as the Democratic Party has failed much of the country and has not spoken out, as leaders like Barack Obama have absented themselves? Who are you hearing the concern from right now, Charlie? You're hearing it from historians, from journalists, from comparative international political scientists who are saying, listen, we know how this playbook goes. And those are the people. These are not hysterical people. These are not partisan political actors. The people who I've heard most cogently and loudly and clearly speaking out right now are people who are much more oriented towards civil society and the national
Mm-hmm.
interest. And they're the ones who are saying as loudly as they can, the time to act to save American institutions is before they are dismantled.
This is such an important point because I think that to a certain extent, and I don't know if this is, I'm going to make up the word, the sort of the punditification of some of the analysis, where you have a lot of the strategists or people who are fronts for, political action committees, or they are activists. They do tend to frame everything in terms of like what works for the Democratic Party, what works against the Democratic Party, what will happen in the midterms. And part of this is a little bit, it's nihilistic to say that we should just roll back and let Trump inshitify the country, because, there are children who are going to be at risk from measles. There are, people losing their jobs. There are services that are being cut. There are real dangers for America. So I guess the question is, do you prioritize the partisan needs of the Democratic Party, or do you prioritize, as you point out, civil society and all of these values? And I think this is a distinction that sometimes gets lost. I think that sometimes, and I'm going to criticize cable television, they don't make a distinction between the people who are just reading the talking points because they work for a political party versus the people who are saying, hey, excuse me, I have people back home who need this help, who are being hurt by this. The fate of the democracy itself is bigger than the fate of a political party. So I guess the question, let me ask you a very specific question, because I got asked this yesterday and I didn't have a good answer for it. We are seeing some of the resistance popping up in some of these town hall meetings, which sounds, which echoes what was happening during the Tea Party. I don't know how effective that's going to be, but it's something, and maybe it will light a fire. But Tuesday night, Donald Trump is going to be speaking before the gelded Congress, the Congress that he has dissed and disempowered so dramatically. What should Democrats do when they show up? First of all, should they show up? And then how should they treat this? And the reason I'm asking this is, in another overused word, the normalization of it. If they really believe this is an existential threat, if they really believe there is a coup going on here, then do we still go through all of the rituals as if it's same old, same old? What should they do, Susan?
Well, I'm lucky not to have to, come up with a strategy.
Right.
But I think you're exactly right about the normalization. That's what I found embedded in Carville's argument and that of others that I found so troubling. There's a political cynicism embedded in that argument, Charlie, that this is forget about everything we told you about fascism in America and
Right.
Donald Trump. Actually, it's just a normal oscillation in American politics, even if a regrettable one. And I understand why elected Democrats might think, as a matter of strategy, it's better to go after extreme right-wing policies. But remember, extreme right-wing policies, while you and I might disagree with them, can be rectified through the tools of our institutions, through normal politics. People can organize to defeat them. They can get a majority in Congress to vote against them. They can get, judges who will not go along with them, right? That's our politics. That's our system as it's working. What's happening right now is our system is being changed and dismantled. And that's the part that's the real crisis. And I think for Democrats, they tend to be much more comfortable talking about the policy fights than they are talking about the more existential fights. And, I get that that's not an easy communications task for them. But I think it's very important to explain and to point out to people that you may not like Donald Trump's policy for dismantling clean energy initiatives and, deregulating things. But as long as he goes about that legally, that's a policy fight that we have to play out in our normal political system. When Donald Trump flouts the law, flouts judicial rulings, tells Congress, I don't care, about the fact that you legally appropriated this money or authorized this agency. I'm going to destroy it anyways because I have unlimited powers.
Hmm.
That's the crisis that we're in right now. And I just feel like clarity of thinking will lead to more clarity of communicating.
You would hope. You would hope. So your big question was why are we, your cousin's question was why are we not in the streets as they would be, say, in France? And again, I'm genuinely trying to work this out, whether or not that would make a difference. I mean, it does feel the lack of physical pushback like that does make it feel as if we are sort of rolling over. On the other hand, um, we know how Donald Trump works and the system that he is creating, and he would like nothing more than to have disorder in the streets that would give him an excuse to use his loyal military, to invoke the Insurrection Act, to reclaim the mantle of law and order. Any act of violence would be used to supercharge his power. It would be his Reichstag fire. So, how do we what's the clarity of thought there? We want to see people pushing back, and yet there are forms of protest that would be counterproductive. Thoughts?
Yes, and Charlotte, I really appreciate you bringing that up because that is a very important point. And again, I don't think, neither my cousin nor I were in any way advocating,
Right.
for this as a particular strategy. I
Yeah.
think Democrats, if anything, are acutely aware of the
Hmm.
risk of calling people into the streets, and that could well be taking Donald Trump's bait. And
Right.
he's made it very clear that he would be prepared to, and in fact is looking for the
Right.
opportunity
Eager.
to invoke the Insurrection Act and to call troops out into the street. So I think that's very important. That is something that we should be acutely aware of the risk there. So it's a descriptive, and analytical point that underscores the extent to which our society is more passive than European society about
Hmm.
politics, and seems to be accepting, a lot of very excessive steps taken by Trump and his administration so far. So that's number one. What does it tell us about America? You know,
Hmm.
Number two, I think you're articulating a fear that many people have when they look at the history of this kind of change in a society by someone with Trump's predilections and views. And the fear there is that not only there will be violence, but in some ways that the Musk revolution demands a sort of violence at some point or another to further consolidate power and to use the shock of the violence to move even more rapidly along the revolutionary path. And I think it is very notable that Musk has already started referring to what he's doing as a revolution. Frankly, when I think of the reading that I've done that's useful in understanding the mindset of Trump and those around him, uh, you know, I look back, a lot of people talk about, Germany in the 1930s, but actually I spent a lot of time studying, the consolidation of power in revolutionary Russia,
Hmm.
in the early and mid 20th century. And, some of those political and frankly psychological lessons apply here as well.
So let me go back to something that we mentioned in passing, which is the various institutions that we would hope would push back. The what do we want to call it? The mainstream media, the legacy media, very much under assault, very aggressive assault from the White House, removing outlets from being able to cover various events. I mean, I thought it was striking that on Friday the AP continues to be forbidden to cover events, but somebody from Russian state media was allowed in the Oval Office. You, one of the biggest differences between this year and say 2017. In 2017, it felt like the media had come into its own, that this was going to be the big story and that they were going to push back. Now it feels as if they're in retreat, not just the Jeff Bezoses of the world, but also as you point out, rather tepid responses to the assault. So give me your sense of what is going on, because among the various guardrails out there, if you lose the free and independent media, then we are in a much darker place than at least if you have that voice out there. So what is the state of play now?
Yeah, I think you're right. The trip wires have been tripped at this point.
Hmm.
And, what I experienced in Putin's Russia, what others have documented in places like Turkey during Erdogan's first years in power, or in other countries that have experienced a rollback in democracy, inevitably going after the independent media is one of the first moves in the playbook.
Mm-hmm.
It's the indicator light that starts to go off, that's flashing. Would-be authoritarians want to dismantle or at least defang independent sources of power and information in the society. And I think that the fact that this Trump administration would move so rapidly toward defanking, dismantling the institutions of independent media, how they covered the White House, I anticipated that, to be honest, Charlie, in this second
Hmm.
Trump term. I didn't know that it would happen quite so quickly. And I find that particularly alarming, because for me, that has
Right.
been a tripwire. And I was privately, saying to my husband and others, like, that I expected the White House
Right.
to eliminate the press pool and to come up with,
Hmm.
sort of Kremlin press pool by the end of this year. Instead, it happened in only 5 weeks. And I saw that Stephen Colbert, went off on the Associated Press thing, and said that from his perspective, the second that the press corps failed to stand up for the Associated Press was the moment that they writ their own doom. And I basically pretty much agree with that. I think that, remember,
Hmm.
Donald Trump isn't even trying to come up with a pretext here. He explicitly said, not only did I order the banning of the Associated Press, but for speech reasons, because
Yes.
they refused to adopt my bogus rewriting of the map of the world and decreeing that the Gulf of Mexico would now be the Gulf of America. And that is as a clear-cut case as you could imagine of punishing a news organization for exercising
Viewpoint.
their
Hmm.
First Amendment rights. And when you didn't have the rest of the press saying this is unacceptable, a line has been crossed here, I thought it was, it made me queasy as a career journalist who spent decades here in Washington. Again, I am nonpartisan. I know,
Right.
I've been outspoken in my role as a columnist, critical of actions of Trump and those surrounding him. But I'm not here telling you what kind of healthcare policy or tax
Yeah.
policy to have. I'm not a partisan, nor do I have any desire to be. I've been a journalist my entire career, and I will tell you that it made me feel queasy and really, frankly, nauseous to see how quickly other news organizations were rushing to put out statements saying, well, we're going to follow Donald Trump. Don't worry. We're going to call
Yeah.
it the Gulf of America. And
That
would
was
you like
bad.
to take your colleagues' seats in the press pool? Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it's just a good reminder if you want a friend in Washington, or even a colleague, get a dog. But those people are acting against their own self-interest, honestly, Charlie,
Well,
because
and the and
the
the, and the
revolution
national
comes for the
self-interest.
AP
Yeah.
first, but
Yeah.
eventually it comes for everybody.
Well, sure. I mean, it's like, what will the standard be next month? So I also was not surprised that they went after the media as aggressively as they did. What was shocking was, to me, was the acquiescence of major media outlets. And I think the worst moment was when ABC settled that lawsuit for $10 million or whatever, about using, sexual abuse versus rape. And deep breath when CBS settles the completely bogus lawsuit against 60 Minutes. This will be abject surrender, but also an indication that there's a loaded gun aimed at every single commentator or reporter out there. Because if ABC won't stand up, if CBS won't stand up, who will stand up against lawsuits that have no merit whatsoever? And I think that as you watch that and watching Jeff Bezos and the owner of the Los Angeles Times, it's not simply that they don't fight back. It's that they're actively rolling over. And I didn't see that coming, to be quite honest with you. Did you? I mean, that's pretty.
Well, unfortunately, the story in other countries suggests that Trump and his team were right, that the weak links are at the top of many of our organizations, Charlie. These ultra wealthy billionaires turn out to be much weaker.
Isn't that something?
Like the $50,000 a year park ranger in many cases has shown a lot more spine than Jeff Bezos. And it's a sad inversion of the sort of power and responsibility gene. It seems that the more power these people have in our society, the weaker they are as people.
Isn't that something? Susan Glasser, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it very much. Susan Glasser from The New Yorker. You have to read her weekly newsletter. And thank you all for listening to this episode of the To the Contrary podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We do this several times a week because more than ever, we need to remind ourselves that we are not the crazy ones.